it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you through this difficult time that we are living and going through. It's a real pleasure also to have all of you together in one place, even virtually. It's a privilege to take advantage of this modern technology, and hopefully the modern technology will not fail us. As an organizer with my colleagues Huda and David and Rawad, we extend our pleasure and the lightness to have you with us. And we hope to have a really good, productive dialogue about the pre-modern Islamic multilingualism. And we will begin with welcoming remarks from Professor Matthew Reynolds. He's the director of the OCCT, and we are really happy and honored to have him with us to start the 3 days conference and to welcome all of you. So the stage now is for you, Matthew.
Great, thanks very much, Hany, and hi everyone. I just wanted to say a few quick words on behalf of OCCT, the Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Research Centre, by way of kind of welcoming and heralding the beginning of this fantastic 3 days of papers and discussion that lies ahead. I'm very pleased that we're able to kind of virtually host the conference, even though that probably doesn't mean, in fact, very much in practical terms. Because, I mean, one of the things I wanted to signal by hosting the conference at OCCT was the importance of the papers that are going to be presented and the discussions that are going to be had, not only within the particular areas of disciplinary expertise that are kind of represented over the next three days, important though obviously that is in itself, but also for critical practice in general, i.e. for someone like me. So I work mainly on European literatures, mainly of quite recent periods, but the kind of issues and themes I'm interested in overlap with the issues and themes that are going to be discussed over the next 3 days. So that's including multilingualism and translation, for instance. And one of the things I'm aware of is that the conceptual frames I have for addressing these issues are pretty limited. So I'm kind of hungry for new ways of thinking about translation, new ways of thinking about multilingualism. And obviously, I'm not the only person in the world who feels like this. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Chakrabarty in that influential book, Provincializing Europe, from a couple of decades ago, which speaks of the need for everyone to learn from theoretical thought enshrined in other existing life practices and their archives, for it's only in this way that we can create plural normative horizons for our own critical practice. And this endeavor to open up the horizons, not only of literary awareness, as it were, not only of the text discussed, but also of critical practice, which is to say the terms with which they are discussed, is at the heart of it's one of the main things we're trying to do in OCCT. As we wrote in one of our early manifesto documents, that in comparative criticism, it's not only the material discussed that is polyglossic, that the critical practices need to be too. You know, you need different frames, different analytical terms, different languages of analysis to bring to bear on the material. So when someone like me, when I look at the program for the next 3 days, I'm extremely excited at the prospect of learning about new ways of conceptualizing language, multilingualism, commentary, translation, the macaronic, and many other literary phenomena. So a huge welcome to you all, and here's heralding an exhilarating 3 days ahead. Thank you. Hany.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I would love, in the name of the organizers as well, to thank Matthew Reynolds for his generosity and also his willingness to make everything easy for us. And we thank so much the OCCT for this brilliant opportunity to be part of the activities of the OCCT. We are really actually honored to be part of the history of OCCT, and we are really grateful for Professor Matthew Reynolds for this chance. I will speak briefly about the aim of the conference and just 2 or 3 minutes about it. So the conference brings together scholars from 13 countries with the shared aim of extending comparative inquiry beyond the Euro-American boundaries of comparative literature. We received over 80 abstracts, half of which were of high standard. The selected 22 papers promised to make an excellent contribution to Islamic cultural poetics as an area of studies. In sum, this is the first scholarly conference dedicated specifically to questions of pre-modern Islamic multilingualism. This conference would never come in reality without a dedication from different parties. So first, I have to thank again Matthew Reynolds for allowing us to have this conference. And the second one, Huda Fakhreddine, she is one of the organizers, and she is Associate Professor of Arabic Literature at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of 2 books, one of Metapoiesis in the Arabic Traditions with Braille, and it was translated recently into Arabic. The other one, the Arabic Prose Poem, Poetic Theory and Practice with Edinburgh University Press. The second organizer is David Larsen. He is an Associate Professor of Liberal Studies, New York University. His translation of The Names of the Lion by Ibn Khaldun, published with Wave Books, received the 2018 Harold Morton London Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets. And we couldn't actually go through this to finish on time, this logistics of the conference without Rawad Wehbe. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, and his translations of Arabic poetry and prose have appeared in Inventory, Words Without Borders, Double Speak, 2 Lines Press, and the Paris Review. And myself, Hany Rashwan, is a research fellow of Arabic poetics at the Global Literary Theory project that is based at University of Birmingham. My first book will be published in early 2022 with the AUC University Press under the title Rediscovering the Ancient Egyptian Literature Through Arabic Poetics. This is the main brief points about the whole conference. And now we have to welcome Professor Fatemeh. So I will introduce briefly Professor Fatemeh to know how lucky we are to have her today with us. So Professor Fatemeh Keshavarz, born and raised in the city of Shiraz, she completed her studies in Shiraz University and the University of London. She taught at Washington University for over 20 years, where she shared the Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages and Literature. In 2012, Professor Fatemeh joined the University of Maryland as the Russian Institute Chair in Persian Language and Literature and Director of the Russian Institute Center for Persian Studies. She is the author of award-winning books, including Reading Mystical Lyric, The Case of Jalaluddin Rumi, Recite in the Name of the Red Rose, and a book of literary analysis and social commentary titled Jasmine and Stars, Reading More Than Lolita in Tehran. She has also published other books and numerous journal articles. She is a published poet in Persian and English and an activist for peace and justice. She was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly on the significance of cultural education. Her NPR show, The Aesthetic Face of Rumi, brought her the Be a Body Award in 2008. In the same year, she received the Herschel Walker Peace and Justice Award. So please welcome with us Professor Fatemeh, and we are really looking forward to hear your brilliant paper.
Thank you so much, Hany, and thank you also to Huda, David, and Matthew for giving the informal address. Just to make it shorter, I'm very, very happy and delighted and grateful to be here. So thank you for the invitation. And as the conference notes show, let me put on my own timer here, hopefully to make sure that I'm not over going my time. Okay. As you know from the program, I'll be speaking about the multilingual poetry, the information superhighway of the medieval Muslim world. A person saw a group of four looking hungry and destitute. He gave them a little money to get themselves something to eat. There was a Turk among them. He said, "Let us buy ourselves some ism." The Persians said, "No, we should buy some angur." The Arab tried to offer a way out and said, "You're both wrong. Let us get some anab." And the Greek, who had been silent till then, said, "Listen, you all, we need some good, fresh estafil." They bickered until a fist fight broke out and all fell to the ground exhausted. The money was lost and food forgotten. Rumi, the Persian-speaking medieval poet and mystic who conquered the 20th century global poetic arena and appears to be doing the same during the 21st century, brings this story in his opus magnum, the Masnavi, a compendium of speculative mysticism. He ends this invented or borrowed story with a fascinating observation. If this group had among them one of those people who speak multiple languages, Azizi Sadzaban, he said, they would have realized that they all wanted the same thing, grapes. True, here the grapes signify something akin to haq or the truth with capital T. And the bickering of the group denotes the way followers of different creeds do not know each other's manners of seeking and celebrating the truth and miss the oneness of the object of their lifelong desire. The pointless fight that ensues has no winners. It will leave everyone deprived and broken, not realizing they wanted the same thing. My point is not that here Rumi highlights the significance of multilingualism per se, but the episode invites a number of interesting observations, and this is in early 13th century, or rather closer to mid. But the episode invites a number of interesting observations in order at least, in order of the least to most interesting and surprising. These are, Rumi knows the word for grapes in all the four languages of Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Greek. He expects most of his listeners, that's the second point, that he expects them to know the same, have the same knowledge, or they wouldn't be laughing with him. They might even think how outlandish to expect that people should know four different words for grapes. And last but not least, he finds knowing multiple languages to be valued enough to be a metaphor for recognizing the beauty, complexity, and unity of the truth, regardless of the garb in which it is wrapped. Insofar as Rumi and many of his contemporaries have stories highlighting the vibrancy of the communities in which they lived, the story of grapes reveals something else as well. It exposes our lack of attention to the sociolinguistic vibrancy of the environment in which artists like Sadi, Rumi, and Larabi, and others like them produce their literary and philosophical works. This diversity is bound to have impacted their personal lives, studies, artistic creations, and its reception by the communities that celebrated their works. Seeing difference and living with it must have been a fact of life rather than a virtue, at least in many places. It would not be surprising then that quite a few such poets wrote their poetry in the mulamma genre or mixed language genre, which is sometimes referred to as macaronics, as was pointed out earlier. In fact, for far too long, comparative literary criticism has not availed itself, at least not sufficiently, of the opportunities to take the exciting diversity of the medieval Muslim communities into account while theorizing. That's one aspect of it. Focusing genre studies primarily on European languages and literatures does not just shrink the horizons of adventure and discovery. It leaves no choice but fitting the rest of the world or token examples from it into the resulting generic structures. Looking for specific notions and definitions or generic patterns leads to seriously faulty assumptions, such as, for example, considering the genre of rubai or quatrain to have less poetic significance because of its brevity. Well, we know that that is not the case as we study not only Omar Khayyam, but the early quatrain writing mystics. Or there is that oft-repeated observation that expresses the view that Muslim communities produced sophisticated poetry, but they did not do much to provide critical understanding of it. And when they did, they remained at the micro level, fixating frequently on wordplay, as well as embellished and hyperbolic artistry. Now, this is also the result of assuming that the books we need to turn to in order to know how people felt about poetry are books of prosody and rhetoric, aruz va bayan, with focus on the fine nuances of poetic language. As a result, it's been assumed that, people like Hafez, Rumi, Kabir, Ibn al-Farid, Ghalib, Yunus Emre, I can go on, and others wrote their masterpieces in an environment in which there was very little awareness of what poetry is, which or appreciate the relevance, significance, and impact of poetry. There are multiple other really faulty assumptions that go on, including, for example, that only highly educated citizens would read and understand poetry. Now, we know from history and from even contemporary times that this is not the case in many parts of the Middle East. Now, in the short time that I have, I will only be able to provide a window into the multilingual medieval Muslim societies whose linguistic border crossing went way beyond words for grapes. And using the example of travel, which I will use today, interaction and teaching in multi-ethnic and multilingual domains to kind of get our attention to how deeply it went into the society. And I propose that a significant amount of culture and artistic cross-fertilization took place in these societies. These exchanges, I suggest, were often made possible through the widespread poetic tradition that bridged cultural experience in Muslim communities across these geographic expanses. At the same time, in a feedback loop, these very exchanges and the multilingual nature of the Muslim urban centers gave poetry, in this case, Persian, as it's my area of expertise, it gave this poetry an expansive reach. In other words, it was just a serious and ongoing give and take. As a result, this poetry emerged as a traveling web of ethical, spiritual, artistic, and intellectual ideas, crisscrossing these lands. A kind of Silk Road, if you like, or even an information superhighway that kept the cultures on its route connected with its intricate communication tools. The large number of manuscripts written in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and the various accounts reported in Tazkiraz, the biographical dictionaries, indicate that we're dealing not with one or two multilingual hubs, but a constellation of them. Time-specific and targeted research is needed before we can do justice to the complexity of this multilingualism, and before we even begin to think about theorizing about them. So I'm hopeful and really excited, and Hany knows that when I saw the title of this conference, I just sent a quick note and said, this is fantastic. So I'm hopeful that the proceedings of this conference and others like it that will ensue be a crucial contribution to, first of all, mapping out these diversities and then having the opportunity to theorize. For my part today, I will offer a preliminary glimpse, admittedly not a systematic study, but hopefully an exhilarating invitation to inaugurate our 3-day search. I will trace the footsteps of a couple of major poets as they travel far and wide, and that where they often find very enthusiastic audiences for their gift of knowledge and poetry. Of course, to be sure, there were always wealthy and influential patrons who supported them, but more often than not, it was their reputation among and respect among the broader community of learners that made them worthy of the attention of the elite. In other words, it was not the other way around. It was that when they arrived, there was a body of population interested in knowing what they had to say. Okay, so let me take you back a little bit. It's the year 1230, or thereabouts, in the historic city of Hamadan in central Iran. A young and obviously learned Sufi scholar is teaching in a madrasa. The standard curriculum in these madrasas is, prophetic tradition, theology, logic, and in those that are bigger and more rooted in learning, they also have science and philosophy on their curriculum. But our poet here was concerned with religious sciences, according to an account that related by an anonymous narrator. To this day, we don't know who that was. In the middle of this solemn educational exchange, enter a group of rowdy, wandering dervishes. They are usually called the qalandars, or as my historian husband likes to call them, they're God's unruly friends. And they disrupt this piece of the madrasa as they pass through, and they are singing ما رقص مسجد به خرابات کشیدیم خط بر ورق زهد کرامات کشیدیم. We took everything we had and moved out of the mosque into the dilapidated wine house, scraped the script of piety from our books, and abandoned the thought of performing miracles. Now, according to our anonymous chronicler, with these words, the young teacher, who is none other than Fakhreddine Iraqi, one of the most celebrated and rebellious poets in the Persian mystical tradition, experiences a moment of deep transformation, a moment so powerful that it changes his entire perspective on life. Oh, there is another detail. Among the qalandars, there is a very beautiful, handsome young minstrel boy with whom, according to the account, Iraqi falls deeply in love. And after that, he is never the same. And he leaves Hamadan following the dervishes, goes to the city of Isfahan in central Iran at first, and disappointed with the learned body of scholars there, he follows the musician groups to the city of Multan in India, or present-day in Pakistan, largest city in the country. Now, today, we believe that this dramatically embellished story, and the likes of which are everywhere in biographical dictionaries, is likely to have been reconstructed later to fit some of the poetry of Iraqi. In other words, we're not really taking it as fully historical account. But it fits so perfectly with Iraqi's rebellious and vibrant voice that often promoted such bold action in order for the human being stop self-worship and step out of that area of considering themselves too important. Now, what is historical, and we know for a fact, is that Iraqi left Hamadan at a very early age in his eventful life, and did go indeed to Multan. And that was the beginning of a whole series of very interesting and dynamic and fascinating stuff in his life. Now, he didn't go directly to Multan. He went through the city of Baghdad, the present-day Iraq, and Damascus. And while he wasn't disappointed in that he did find things that were interesting to him, he still was looking apparently for some discipleship of a major Sufi master. And so he went to Multan and he attended a session that Bahauddin Zakaria Multani, the major Sufi figure of the region at the time, had. For whatever reason, either Bahauddin advised him or he decided, he actually left abruptly and went all the way to the territories beyond the Oxus River, Mawara al-Nahr, and in the cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Khojand. So my point here is all these territory was in fact so easy to travel through. Now, we don't know if he had difficulties financially or in any other way, but we know that actually, even though he was a young poet, in some of these places, particularly in Mawara al-Nahr, there were people who knew him. So his reputation was already circulating there. And then we know that he came back to Multan, and then he became a disciple of Bahauddin, and he lived there for 25 years. In fact, it would be fascinating to do a study to see how much Sindhi he did attempt to learn and how that impacted his later work. After the death of Bahauddin, he left, and this time he went to Amman, Hijaz, and Mecca for his pilgrimage. And finally, towards Anatolia, the city of Konya, which had only a few years earlier welcomed the Rumi family, traveling all the way from Vakhsh and Balkh to westward, and settled finally in Konya. So he arrived there, and there he met Sadruddin Ghunavi, a major, another mega Sufi figure. An important thing that happens here is that through the teachings of Sadruddin, Iraqi falls in love with the works of Ibn al-Arabi, the Grand Sufi of Cordoba. So, just imagine the centers, the hubs that we have overlapping here from the beginning of his life to what actually constructs this web of intellectual and artistic exchange that he goes through. Now, he becomes then such an important commentator on Ibn al-Arabi that his treatise, the Lama'at, is later on commented on by others, and in fact is responsible for introducing, one of the people who seriously introduced Ibn al-Arabi to Persian mystics and those interested in that. In Anatolia, he is embraced so lovingly that in fact he is given his own khanaqah in the city of Tokat, but unfortunately the wars that are going on still in and around, the leftovers from the Mongol invasion and later smaller dynasties ruling the area, that he leaves. But he doesn't go back to Iran. He doesn't go back to Mawara al-Nahr. he goes to Egypt. And we certainly, by then, we know that his work is known in Egypt. Of course, his Arabic must have been perfect, because as an educated Iranian literati, you cannot be without Arabic. But nonetheless, his works, which are completely in Persian, he's not writing with, except for occasional quotes, he does not really write in Arabic, is so known in the Cairo that the Sultan, the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Saifuddin Qalawun, invites him to be the preacher of, and he does preach for a while there. And for reasons that are probably more political, he leaves that area and goes to Damascus and lives there for a while, and then dies in that city. Now, again, my point here is there's so much that could be unearthed by just looking at what this person's knowledge and experience was a synthesis of, that it wasn't just, that it's worth deep thinking. Now, I cannot take many more people and do the same kind of in-depth looking at where they went and what they did, but I want to emphasize the fact that Fakhreddine Ravi was by no means an exception. If we had 5 hours here, I would be introducing poet after poet that, going through the Silk Road of literary understanding and connection, traveled back and forth and benefited from all these cultures. I mean, one example that quickly comes to mind is actually the family of Rumi, whose father, Baha'u'llah, was finding himself in a difficult position in Balkh. Now, Rumi was born in 1207, and actually not in Balkh, but in a smaller city called Vakhsh, and which was an important hub at the time of learning. But much of their lives afterwards went on in Balkh. And when the father, Baha'u'llah, who was actually the star of Rumi, was only 5 years old at the time, he decided to totally leave that area and go westwards. And he does that. He goes through Marv, Herat, Nishabur. Of course, these are mega cities in Iran, and people speak Persian, no problem. Then he goes to Baghdad and Mecca. Then he stays in Damascus for a while. And they finally, again, even though they have started in the opposite direction of what Arabi does, finally they all also attracted to Central Anatolia. And finally, as you know, he's buried in the city of Konya. So they settled finally in Central Anatolia. Now, such a long travel, and let me just quickly say, by no means I want to romanticize these travels. I'm sure that they were very impacted by difficulties, financial, security, roads, all of that stuff is important. So that's not the point. The point is that, and particularly for the family of Baha'u'llah, the father of Rumi, which brought the whole family and the entourage of the people who were in their constellation of life, they must have had some difficult times, but they were deeply welcomed almost anywhere they went. And Rumi must have had some fun experiences, because he talks about how good it is that we can move from place to place. And he must have heard so many different languages, hence the words for grape. But he says, for example, if the tree was able to move from place to place, it would not suffer from the saw and the harshly inflicted wounds. So obviously they felt that they were going from places of danger to places of safety. And then, but then like grapes, here too, movement is more than just going from city to city in Rumi's poetry. It ultimately is, and let me give you the Persian, چو اندکی بنمودم بدان تو باقی را ز خوی خویش سفر کن به خوی خلق خدا. So I'm showing you a little bit of these travels, he says, because in the poem he also talks about the traveling of the sun and the moon, and the day and night is caused by that. But in the end, he says, but there are many more journeys, and I give you the responsibility to find them. Ultimately, travel from your own attributes to the attributes of God. So he's, as a Sufi, is definitely loyal to that major trip. But the point here is that Rumi literally grew up having seen so many people, and it's not living differently and also speaking different languages. We know that, for example, in Erzincan, in Larende and Karaman, where they stayed in Anatolia, there were plenty of Armenian speakers and Greek speakers and so on. And again, they were welcomed by Alauddin Keykubat. They were offered residence in the palace. Baha'u'llah refused that and said, palaces are for the kings like you, just give me a madrasa. And that's what they did. They built him a madrasa. And let me end, because I'm getting very close to the end of my time, but I cannot leave Sa'di out of this, the master lyricist that lived and was born and lived in my own city. And he spent 30 years of his life traveling. But fortunately, he spoke about it a lot, particularly in two of his works, The Orchard and The Rose Garden, Bustan and Golestan. And he remained very conscious of what these travels had given him and was very proud of it. He wrote, much have I roamed through the world's far quarters, spending time with all kinds of people. Enjoyment I found in every corner of the globe. From every harvest, I gained a corn ear. And he also sometimes, with a great deal of pride, says that when sometimes he was anonymous as he traveled, and he would join a group of literary discussions and conversations. And then when people found out he was from Shiraz and he loved poetry, they would say, "As Sukhanan Sa'di che dari?" What do you have from Sa'di's latest writing? And so he really tells us that the words had traveled before him. And I want to end with this, because this is one of my most favorite pieces in The Orchard. And there are three verses I'm going to give you in Persian and in English. ز دریای عمان برآمد کسی، ز دریای عمان برآمد کسی، سفر کرده دریا و هامون بسی، عرب دیده و ترک و تاجیک و روم، ز هر جنس در نفس پاکش علوم، جهان گشته و دانش اندوخته، سفر کرده و صحبت آموخته. So he's talking about a very distinguished person that impressed him. And I think it was probably his desire to be that person. It says, from the sea of Oman, there came a man, much traveled by ocean and desert. Arabs he had seen, and Turks, Persians, and Greeks. From every race, his pure soul had learned its science. World traveled, wisdom he had amassed. Traveled, he had learned manners and sociability. So thank you very much for listening to all of this. And my point here is that through its geographical and intercultural reach, this poetry enabled the readers to imagine themselves to be members of a community that was much wider than the one in which they were born. And the lands were vast and people were very different. And thinking that this is happening at the time of the wars, multiple wars, including, Janghai Salibi, please help me. The
Crusades.
The Crusades, thank you, was going on at the time of the Crusades, at the time where, the understanding of the other was highly tarnished. And yet, that's a point I'm hoping to leave behind. And yet, without the mosaic of multilingual communities along this much-traveled Silk Road, the poetic artifact that we celebrate today. I'm sorry, this is not stuff. So, and yet without the mosaic of multilingual communities along this much-traveled Silk Road, the poetic artifact that we celebrate today would not have found a nourishing habitat. Thank you.
We are really grateful, Professor Fatemeh, for this brilliant and wonderful lecture. And I'm sure all my colleagues here, and most of them, they are really young, so they have the future of academia in their hands. I think they appreciate a lot the many corners you have opened by your brilliant lecture, especially how to link travel to multilingual. So this is a brilliant point to be considered as well. Like Abi Hilal al-Askari himself, he never left Askar Makra, and he wrote a lot of books about Arabic balagha in Arabic in all his life. So things like that should be considered and highlighted for the next wave of knowledge production about Islamic multilingualism. I have to thank you again, Professor Fatemeh, for your brilliant lecture and dedicating a good time for us to celebrate this new wave of knowledge production. And also I have to remind you that we will have another keynote speaker also highlighting the notion of travel through how people learned Arabic in the pre-modern type. And he will begin for sure with the Persian figure Sibawayh, who wrote the first Arabic grammar book. So things like that will be all connected and melted in one pot to produce a brilliant outcome. So thanks again, Professor Fatemeh. We really appreciated your brilliant lecture, and I think everyone is happy now. And people.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and I really I'm looking forward to the conference and to the keynote, but to everyone's presentation. Thank you.
We are really honored and grateful for you, Professor Fatemeh. And now I will hand the stage for David Larsen to begin the first session of the conference.